Thank you for rejoining us back in the main room following our short breakout sessions. So you've joined us this afternoon for our third keynote speaker, who is Dr. Robert Beshara. So thank you so much to join us. Dr. Beshara will give us a talk with regards to his work, the title of which is The Analytical Psychology of a Transmodern Praxis, 3 Theoretico-Practical Resources from the Underside of Modernity. In terms of background, Dr. Robert is an author of Decolonial Psychoanalysis Towards Critical Islamophobia Studies, Freud and Said, Contra-Neutral Psychoanalysis as Liberation Praxis, and from Kanye TA, The Legacy of Unconditional Love. He's also the editor of Critical Introduction to Psychology and Critical Psychology Praxis, Psychosocial Non-Alignment to Modernity and Coloniality. Furthermore, Dr. Robert is the translator of Murad Wahab's Fundamentalism and Secularization. He's also the founder of the Critical Psychology website and works as assistant professor and chair of Arts and Human Sciences at Northern New Mexico College. So without further ado, I will now turn to Dr. Robert, who will begin his keynote speech, and then we'll come back towards the end for some questions and answers. You're more than welcome to post any questions that you have in the chat, so we'll refer to them after Dr. Robert has delivered his speech. Dr. Robert.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and I want to thank the conference organizers for the invitation, and greetings to everyone in the Zoom meeting. It's 7 a.m. here in Santa Fe, so I know some of you are in the afternoon or the evening in different parts of the world, different time zones. So the title of the paper is Analectical Psychology as a Transmodern Praxis, 3 Theoretical Practical Resources from the Underside of Modernity. As you shall see, the paper is very much inspired by the work of Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel. Undergraduate students in any introduction to psychology course are introduced to this oft-repeated story about the so-called birth of psychology as a modern scientific discipline in 1879, with Wilhelm Wundt's establishment of the first experimental psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. For one counter-narrative, see, for instance, the contributions of Muslim scientists such as Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Tufayl, and Ibn Rushd to psychology between the 9th and 13th centuries Common Era. This hegemonic story has a dual purpose. 1, confirming psychology as a science and therefore cutting its centuries-long connection with philosophy, and 2, instituting psychology as a chiefly Euro-modern discipline and subsequently de-emphasizing non-European contributions from ancient times to the present day. The story of psychology, however, is complicated by a bifurcation within the history of the discipline itself: psychology as a natural science versus psychology as a human science. The former camp attempts to align itself with the natural sciences, physics, biology, chemistry, and objectivity. Consequently, it lays stress on experimental research and quantification. The latter camp strives to reconnect psychology with its humanistic roots through philosophy, history, and theory. It seeks to honor subjectivity through qualitative research. Critical psychologists clearly belong to the second camp, but as human scientists, the critiques of naturalistic Euro-modern psychology tend to be from the perspectives of critical modernism and postmodernism. In other words, their critiques, while valuable, remain Eurocentric. In this essay, I will argue for an ecocentric, transmodern praxis, which Burton and Osorio qualify as analectical psychology, based on Enrique Dussel's philosophy of liberation. Another name for analectical psychology is decolonial psychology. Lest I be misunderstood, this transmodern praxis is meant to extend, as opposed to cancel, the already established critique within critical psychology. Before I unpack these terms and other ones, which may be unfamiliar to some, I shall first address both the coloniality of psychology as a modern scientific discipline and the silence of critical psychology in the face of this coloniality. I will then end with an argument for the importance of centering radical work by indigenous, Black, and global Southern theorists, before recommending 3 theoretical, practical resources that are neglected in critical psychology, and which should be central in analectical psychology as a transmodern praxis. By radical, I mean specifically anti-capitalist and anti-racist. In other words, to be radical is to materially struggle for collective liberation and against colonial oppression. Throughout the essay, I framed the discipline of psychology as an ideological, modern colonial project that is situated within the structure of racial capitalism. Therefore, my historicization of modernity coloniality is not meant to suggest that racial capitalism is an event. Rather, my aim is to contextualize the emergence of psychology as a scientific discipline in late 19th century Europe and to document some of the ideological effects of this emergence, namely psychologization and universalization. To neutralize these effects, I employ decoloniality and materiality as radical tools of psychosocial analysis. The coloniality of psychology as a modern scientific discipline. Coloniality, as opposed to colonialism as a material practice, is a relevant theoretical term for analectical psychology because it signifies an unconscious style of thought, such as not thinking that the US is a settler colonial society or that the territory of Puerto Rico is a franchise colony. To understand the significance of psychology's emergence as a modernist science in the late 19th century, one must first understand the invention of modernity in the 15th century and how it was and continues to be dialectically linked with coloniality. For while modernity is undoubtedly a European occurrence, it also originates in a dialectical relation with non-Europe. In other words, Euromodernity is only intelligible in relation to its negated non-European alterity. For the rhetoric of modernity has always been and continues to be ideologically and materially sustained by a coloniality of power, structured around two fundamental axes, a racial axis and a labor axis. However, this coloniality of power is usually occluded by what Dussel calls the myth of modernity, which he writes perpetrates a gigantic inversion. The innocent victim becomes culpable, and the culpable victimizer becomes innocent. We must bear this relationship between the culpable victimizer and the innocent victim in mind when thinking about the modern psychologist vis-a-vis the psychologized as colonized, which is the ethical question of psychological harm or torture in experimental and applied research, such as the Little Albert experiment, the Milgram experiments on obedience, and the Stanford prison experiment. Of course, none of these experiments represents the minimum acceptable standard of ethical or even scientific research, yet the latter two in particular are often taught as classic studies in social psychology courses. Todd Sloan, drawing on Jürgen Habermas, qualified this precise relationship between the objective psychologist and the psychologized subject as the colonization of the life world. The coloniality of psychology becomes clear when one looks at how psychology furthers the two fundamental axes of race and labor. Psychology, or the psy-complex, more generally, is in service to capital through at least two abstractions. One, psychologization, which has served directly or indirectly to strengthen the oppressive structures by drawing attention away from them and toward individual and subjective factors. And two, an idealist and universalizing emphasis on the primacy of consciousness, which is a function of commodity fetishism that does not so much dispense with philosophical contemplation as it grants such contemplation a scientific status. Put differently, psychologists often reduce and depoliticize complex psychosocial phenomena to the abstract level of the psyche, qua behavior, the brain, and/or cognition. And they do so in a positivistic fashion, which entails ignoring the uncontrollable negativism, i.e., the materiality of the social world outside the experimental laboratory. This psychologizing tendency, which undoubtedly aligns with the current ethos of neoliberal capitalism, is paradoxically accompanied by a universalizing tendency that can be demonstrated with a quick survey of psychological experiments since the beginning of the discipline, wherein the universal subject of psychology was assumed to be bourgeois, male, and of European descent. This chauvinistic trend has changed over the last 50 years, particularly since the crisis in social psychology debates that took place in the 70s, which explored questions of ethics, methodology, and diversity. For example, the National Research Act was passed into law in 1974, 1 year after the ethical methodological scandal known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Critical psychology and qualitative research rose like a phoenix out of the ashes of this crisis, but critiques of the discipline's naturalism, as well as human scientific approaches, can be traced back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While the reality of psychological studies today are quite different and reflect the diversity of the worlds in which they are situated, the colonial logics of the discipline continue to plague our research as a function of the myth of modernity. These psychologizing, universalizing tendencies, however, have been resisted by liberation psychologists who do not confuse bias with objectivity, and radical psychoanalysts who privilege the sociability of the unconscious. After all, psychoanalysis is the repressed other of psychology. Being neutral in the face of oppression is neither objective nor ethical, which is why reflexivity and bias on the part of the analectical psychologist are important first steps toward psychosocial analyses that are grounded in decoloniality and materiality. For example, Ian Parker argues that the current medical model, with its bonanza of so-called mental disorders that function as the basis for mis- or over-diagnosis and treatment in Euro-America, essentially pathologizes distress under capitalism through psychologization and universalization. Parker frames distress from a psychoanalytic perspective, not as a neurocognitive substance, but as a psychosocial process. Consequently, the globalization of psychology, with its management of distress through medicalization, that is, reducing a psychosocial process causally to a biological substance, mirrors the structure of global capitalism itself, which reproduces distress via exploitation and alienation. Moving from the labor axis to the racial one, the reader is encouraged to check out the excellent text, Race, Racism, and Psychology, Towards a Reflexive History, which provides an overview of the history of racism within the discipline of psychology itself. Psychology's so-called objective or neutral analyses of psyche occlude the material conditions in capitalist societies which position us as a certain social being within the division of labor. Our social being is specifically determined by what Quijano calls coloniality of labor, which sheds light on the primacy of racial capitalism in our decolonial analyses. Modernity coloniality, which is inspired by the work of Aníbal Quijano, signifies the historical and ongoing colonial relationship between Europe and its alterity, which mirrors the psychoanalytic dialectic between consciousness and the unconscious, respectively. To put it another way, modernity is a conscious rhetoric which is premised on an unconscious colonial logic, such as Africa as the dark continent or Latin America as the US's backyard. The colonial unconscious, which sustains the rhetoric of modernity, is none other than the metaphorical, that is, ideological repression of non-European epistemologies and ontologies through the literal, that is, material, oppression of non-European cultures and peoples. Duran and Duran show from a Native American post-colonial perspective that the solution to psychology's coloniality is not cross-cultural psychology, not to be confused with either cultural psychology or a cross-indigenous perspective. For Duran, cross-cultural investigation is performed through the inoculated gaze of a psychology whose discourse is founded on the premise of the universal subject, the subject of a historical project of emancipation via reason, which is of course mythic since it excludes the reason of the other. The problem, however, is not reasoning in psychology per se, but the irrationality of the violence of the modern myth. This irrational violence is the unconscious colonial logic, which renders Euromodernity as a form of reasoning mythic. Since there is no possibility of completely decolonizing modernity or absolutely delinking it from coloniality, the decolonial and pragmatic answer to modernity then is neither critical modernity nor postmodernity, but rather transmodernity, which is the best of modernity and its alterity. I must note that when I use the value-laden term best, I am thinking of Dussell's ethics of liberation, along with Johann Galtung's conception of social justice as positive peace, or as the absence of structural violence. In Deconstructing the Myth of Modernity, Dussel writes, the birth date of modernity is 1492, even though its gestation, like that of the fetus, required a period of intrauterine growth, whereas modernity gestated in the free, creative medieval European cities, it came to birth in Europe's confrontation with the other. By controlling, conquering, and violating the other, Europe defined itself as discoverer, conquistador, and colonizer of an alterity, likewise constitutive of modernity. Europe never discovered this other as other, but covered over the other as part of the same, i.e., Europe. Modernity dawned in 1492, and with it the myth of a special kind of sacrificial violence, which eventually eclipsed whatever was non-European. Conversely, Sunil Bhatia, who has pioneered the post-colonial line of research within critical psychology over the last 2 decades, is more optimistic about decolonizing psychology, which for him entails examining both how Euro-American scientific psychology becomes the standard bearer of psychology throughout the world, and how specific local cultural flows and ideas play an important role in shaping identities across the world. The emergence of psychology as a modern scientific discipline in the late 19th century coincides with the scramble for Africa. This co-occurrence did not go unnoticed by the new imperialists, and psychology was put to use by colonial administrators as a management tool in the so-called civilizing mission. For psychology is yet another tool with which to mold minds. This was the case in Africa when European imperialists colonized it. The situation was similar in India, in Latin America, and among indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. Furthermore, psychology can be regarded as a secular ideology. For example, Slive, Smith, and Birchfield, drawing on the work of Paul Meehl, write about psychotherapists as crypto-missionaries who attempt to convert their clients to their own value system. The coloniality of psychology, not mentioning the laws of the psychology of colonization, has been explored most lucidly by a certain Martiniquois revolutionary psychiatrist in the context of the Algerian War of Independence between 54 and 62. In A Dying Colonialism, Frantz Fanon writes, the native, i.e. Algerian doctor, because of the operation of the complex psychological laws that govern colonial society, frequently finds themselves in a difficult position. For Fanon, non-European psychologists, particularly in franchise and settler colonial societies, are colonized intellectuals because of their scientific mimicry and subsequent collusion with the colonial system, which are effects of the psych-complex as a technology of the colonizing power. The transmodern corrective to the coloniality of psychology entails embracing both modernity and its alterity. It would be irrational to both reject everything produced by Euromodern psychologists as colonial and accept all of the contributions of Euromodern psychology as inherently good or universally applicable. Similarly, I'm not arguing that non-European psychologies are ipso facto morally superior, but simply that these subaltern psychologies, given their exteriority vis-a-vis modernity, shed light on other negated epistemologies, ontologies, and methodologies. Transmodernity then means subsuming the emancipative aspects of psychology as a modern scientific discipline in a world horizon which involves rejecting psychology's mythic sacrificial behavior toward its others. Those negated others are namely non-Europeans. Therefore, centering indigenous, Black, and global Southern psychologies constitutes an important feature of our transmodern praxis. What we call psychology, without qualifying it as Euro-American, was never and can never be universal. Even though it is a provincial psychology, since it is essentially of an Anglo-Saxon variety, it established itself as the hegemonic psychology, as opposed to being one significant approach among many. The hegemony of Euro-American psychology is a function, therefore, of cultural linguistic imperialism, which was only possible due to the First World Wars, the First World's political-economic hegemony. This post-World War II context sheds light on the materiality of post-colonialism, which can also be paradoxically characterized as neocolonialism without colonies. Transmodernity rejects psychology's false universality and advocates instead for pluriversality as multiple universalities, which is akin to cultural pluralism as opposed to multiculturalism. At this juncture, Bassem Tibi's controversial notion of late culture guiding culture comes to mind, since the assumption within multiculturalism is that subaltern cultures must assimilate to the hegemonic, i.e. guiding culture, which is supposedly civil. While I wholeheartedly agree with Tibi on societies having a consensually accepted value system, I find it, however, highly problematic when he ethnocentrically equates said system with a European value system. I think it is crucial for the survival of all forms of life on this planet that we seriously think and act in terms of an eco-centric value system. In my view, Dussel provides us with one compelling blueprint, and it is not the only one, for such an eco-centric value system with his magnum opus, Ethics of Liberation. In sum, mainstream Euro-American psychology, that is, psychology as a modern scientific discipline or as a natural science, is the dominant paradigm which pretends to universality, but actually generalizes from a particular situation at the heart of the state-capital-colonial nexus. Hence, experimental psychology, psychometrics, therapy, and management of the individual as the dominant approaches. The silence of critical psychology vis-a-vis the coloniality of psychology. To begin, I theoretically and practically position myself as a critical psychology who is not attempting to save or improve the discipline of psychology. I critique psychology because I'm interested in actualizing a transmodern praxis grounded in decoloniality and materiality. In other words, I'm trying to not only denaturalize psychology by reclaiming its human scientific roots, but also to undiscipline psychology through radical epistemologies of the South, which I will address towards the end of the essay when discussing 3 theoretical practical resources from the underside of modernity. In this section, I will critique critical psychology's silence in the face of psychology's coloniality, building on but stretching Parker's argument that what is called critical psychology in the English-speaking world is already starting to colonize and sanitize what they, critical psychologists, have been doing. Parker is writing from a revolutionary Marxist perspective, and he views psychology as an ideological state apparatus within capitalism, which is ultimately in the service of the repressive state apparatus. In other words, psychology's primary function as an ideological state apparatus is to interpolate us, concrete individuals, through psychologization into concrete subjects of the oppressive and violent state-capital-colonial nexus. For this reason, like Parker, I do not see critical psychology as an ideological subdiscipline of psychology, but instead as the material form of ideology critique or praxis vis-a-vis psychology qua ideology. I extend Parker's Marxist critique from a decolonial perspective in order to emphasize the primacy of both the racial and labor axes in the coloniality of power. Building on Edward Said's engagement with critical theory, Bruce Baum writes, the Frankfurt School failed to engage adequately colonial racism and anti-colonial resistance. The critical theorists' account of racism was Eurocentric and too narrowly focused on anti-Semitism. I see a similar problem in critical psychology. Namely, its critiques of psychology as a modern science are valid, but they tend to be Eurocentric, i.e. citing mostly, if not only, European theorists. And they fail to engage adequately the coloniality of psychology, let alone the question of decolonial liberation. Perhaps following Robert Nichols, dispossession ought to be reconstructed as a category of critical psychology, one that may serve to mediate between critiques of capitalism and colonialism, with a particular focus on the late modern and contemporary Anglo-settler world. Dispossession, according to Nichols, is a broad macro-historical process related to the specific territorial acquisition logic of settler colonization. Critical psychology owes a great deal of debt to the early Euromodern tradition of theorizing and practicing psychology as a human science, which can be traced back to the works of Wilhelm Dilthey, Franz Brentano, Edmund Husserl, and Sigmund Freud, among others. These works are also the theoretical roots of current qualitative research approaches. In addition to hermeneutics, phenomenology, and psychoanalysis, the Frankfurt School's critical theoretical approach, which was mostly Freudo-Marxist, is another key influence on critical psychology, not mentioning the legacy of Marxist psychologists such as Lev Vygotsky and Henry Wallin and other radicals, European philosophers, psychoanalysts, and anti-psychiatrists. The previous paragraph demonstrates the Eurocentrism of critical psychology, which neglects through its history and ongoing citational practices non-European points of reference. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this rule, which I will address in the next section. For instance, the Annual Review of Critical Psychology has included 2 special issues on critical psychologies from around the world. However, it's not a question of tokenism. These critical psychological interventions, particularly the ones from the Global South, should be normalized in critical psychology. In other words, they're not simply a peripheral element to be included merely to demonstrate the diversity of our critics, especially when their key points of reference remain Eurocentric. Further, our critiques of psychology need not be situated within the European intellectual tradition mentioned in the previous paragraph. We can begin our decolonial critiques from other traditions, such as Dussel, Fanon, Said, Martin, Barrault, etc., be in critical dialogue with the European tradition, while grounding a transmodern praxis in the ongoing material reality of colonial dispossession. This is how we remain focused on the fact that our ideology critiques of psychology are simultaneously material critiques of racial capitalism. While psychology as a human science may sound emancipatory to the ears of most critical psychologists, the Eurocentric conceptions of the human, the subject of psychological science, are highly problematic in the eyes of non-Europeans. Sylvia Wynter shows, for example, the genealogy of the human from the theocentric conception of the human Christian to the new humanist and ratiocentric conception of the human man, i.e. as homo politicus, or the political subject of the state. This modern colonial category of the human never included those primitives and barbarians who were regarded by the European bourgeoisie as subhuman. As Wynter shows, the coloniality of being was enacted by the dynamics of the relation between man, overrepresented as the generic, ostensibly supra-cultural human, and its subjugated human others, i.e. Indians and Negroes. In other words, the universal subject of psychology is none other than this man, or overrepresented human. This, however, does not mean that the category of the human ought to be abandoned in the name of anti- or post-humanism. On the contrary, the category must be radicalized via Fanon's New Humanism to specifically include and be overrepresented by non-Christians, women, and non-Europeans, since affirming the reason of the other is a step toward a transmodern worldhood. Following Enrique Dussel, Burton, and Osorio renounced the 2 European paradigms for critiquing psychology as a modern science, namely critical modernism and postmodernism. The former recognizes some of the problems inherent in the modernist paradigm, but retains a commitment to the emancipatory elements of rational Enlightenment methods. And the latter not only throws out the erroneous universalism of the modernist colonial model, it also rejects the advances in reason produced through the development of that system. Transmodernity, on the other hand, moves beyond the alternatives of critical modernity and postmodernity, promising to overcome the shortcomings of each, constructing a more adequate and superordinate orientation invigorated by the critical perspective of the oppressed other. Analectical psychology as a transmodern praxis. According to Dussel, critical modernity and postmodernity, which are the 2 dominant paradigms in critical psychology, are Eurocentric critiques of modernity from within. Transmodernity, conversely, surpasses this Eurocentrism while upholding negated alterity, the dignity and identity of other cultures, and the cover over other. In other words, transmodernity is a decolonial critique from the underside of modernity, which might in effect be the anadialectical solution to psychology's paradigm wars, transcending them with this positive dialectic extended from the underside, the analectic, in underpinning the method of psychology not just epistemologically and ontologically, but in the first place, ethically. Here's what Dussel means by anadialectic or analectic. Dialectic in its positive sense, or anadialectic, permits us to open ourselves to methods that not only are not scientific, but are not even theoretical, because analectic is a method whose point of departure is an ethical choice in a concrete historical praxis. This is of great importance because without it, one would not be able to describe the epistemological level of the human sciences, which retain analogies with the factual sciences, but are distinct because natural beings are not human beings, beings with history, culture, and freedom. Analectical psychology, then, as Burton and Osorio show, is ecocentric, pluriversal, critical realist, liberatory, human scientific, and anadialectical, with its foundational point of reference being liberation praxis. Analectical psychology can also be qualified as a really social psychology, a decolonial psychology, a transmodern psychology, a pluriversal psychology, or a border psychology. According to Walter Mignolo, pluriversality or pluriversal epistemology is a form of ecocentric critical thinking, which can also be characterized following Gloria Anzaldúa as border thinking. Analectical psychology entails transdisciplinary border thinking, which is directed toward using the disciplines, for example, psychology, beyond the disciplines themselves, aiming and building a world without modernity coloniality. Border thinking is actional, hence the centrality of praxis. Pluriversal epistemology emerges from diverse local experiences through time and around the world, between local Western histories and non-Western local histories, and interconnects the plurality and diversity of decolonial projects. Further, Santos addresses pluriversality in terms of epistemologies of the South, which he defines as ways of knowing born in the struggle against capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Raewyn Connell explores the same topic using the phrase Southern theory, which for her calls attention to periphery-center relations in the realm of knowledge. Yet another important nomenclature is global social theory, which refers to concepts, topics, and thinkers from around the world. Transmodernity is an ethics-based praxis which refounds the project of human emancipation that had been conceived within the totality of the dominant world system as one of liberation from exploitation that can only be finally achieved by reaching on equal terms to those beyond that system. This section is titled Analectical Psychology as a Transmodern Praxis because the aim of our decolonial and material critiques is to reflect on critical psychology in order to act upon the capitalist colonial world. For this reason, Dussel qualifies transmodernity as a practico-political program characterized by ecological civilization, popular democracy, and economic justice. In sum, analectical psychology does not cancel critical psychology. Rather, it materially grounds our decolonial critiques in a transmodern praxis. 3 theoretical practical resources from the underside of modernity. According to Freire, liberation is a revolutionary process, which must be led by the oppressed for the humanization of all, i.e., the oppressed and oppressors. For this reason, it is important for analectical psychologists to not only cite, but also center radical work by indigenous Black and global Southern theorists in their transmodern praxis. I would further emphasize being in dialogue in our research with living scholars, activists, practitioners who are on the front lines of the struggle for collective liberation. This ethos is inspired by initiatives such as Cite Black Women and scholars like Sarah Ahmed, who is reflexive about her citational practice, for citation as a praxis is inherently a political act. Ahmed writes that citations are the materials from which we create our dwellings. Therefore, in closing, I will recommend 3 theoretical practical resources from the underside of modernity that can facilitate our dwelling, becoming a transmodern worldhood. This final section is not meant to be exhaustive. Rather, my effort is to provide selective examples as sources of inspiration. for analectical psychologists who dream of living in a transmodern world. Indigenous praxis. Indigenous praxis refers to radical indigenous theories and practices developed by native folks, both before and after the colonization of the Americas in 1492. As far as psychology is concerned, indigenous works typically emphasize the centrality of historical trauma and attempt to ground their accounts in an indigenous perspective, which is inherently pluriversal given the heterogeneity of First Nations. An excellent example here is the overlooked text, Native American Postcolonial Psychology. As we continue to experience modernity-induced environmental disasters, indigenous ecopsychology as both a tradition and a way of life, particularly with its emphasis on the interdependence between humans and the non-human world, becomes the obvious path forward through the crisis, what Nick Estes aptly calls history as the future. Indigenous praxis also provides us with the tools for decolonizing Euromodern histories and methodologies. Adams et al., for instance, write about indigenization as a strategy whereby locally grounded researchers and practitioners reclaim local or indigenous wisdom to produce forms of knowledge that resonate with local realities and better serve local communities. For them, it is one of the three it's one of three approaches to decolonizing psychological science, the other two being accompaniment and denaturalization. Finally, indigenization also has an international dimension, which Steven Saleta highlights when he writes about the revolutionary links between the Palestinian struggle for liberation and the struggles of indigenous folks on Turtle Island and elsewhere. Additionally, Estes grounds the radical notion of solidarity in the indigenous praxis of kinship relations, which links humans with non-human animals and with the land. The Red Nation, a coalition co-founded by Estes, indexes the signifier red to link indigeneity with socialism in order to reframe solidarity as kinship. Black praxis. Black praxis refers to radical theories and practices developed by members of the African diaspora, particularly descendants of slaves. Cedric J. Robinson's term for this praxis is the Black radical tradition. That is, the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. And his examples of Black radicals include W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and Richard Wright, but the list obviously includes other Black men, Eric Williams, Oliver Cox, Walter Rodney, and many Black women, Claudia Jones, Angela Davis, Sylvia Wynter. Robinson adds, Black radicalism is a negation of Western civilization, but not in the direct sense of a simple dialectical negation. Here, Robinson is arguing that Black radicalism is a different, perhaps more anarchist program for revolutionary change, adjacent to but distinguishable from Marxism. He writes, the record of resistance for 4 centuries or more, from Nueva España to Nyasaland, leaves in no doubt the specifically African character of those struggles. Resistances were formed through the meanings that Africans brought to the New World as their cultural possession. Meanings sufficiently distinct from the foundations of Western ideas as to be remarked upon over and over by the European witnesses of their manifestations. Meanings enduring and powerful enough to survive slavery to become the basis of an opposition to it. With Western society as a condition, that tradition almost naturally assumed a theoretical aspect as well. In other words, Black radicalism must be understood on its own terms, not through a Eurocentric lens. As a distinct praxis without reducing it to slavery, that critical foundation for capitalism. Robinson's most important theoretical innovation in Black Marxism is perhaps that of racial capitalism. Here is his account. The development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions, so too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. To clarify, racial capitalism is not a subtype of capitalism. Robinson's point, also echoed by Quijano, is that capitalism has always been and continues to be racial. In other words, there is a direct link between the colonization of the non-European world, along with the enslavement of non-European peoples, and the accumulation of wealth in Europe, which then provided the necessary fertile ground for a modern discipline like psychology to emerge as a science in late 19th century Germany. To highlight a few more resources, the reader is encouraged to explore Black Psychology and the Association of Black Psychologists, which publishes the Journal of Black Psychology. For instance, whenever I teach social psychology, I find myself returning to Clark and Clark's racial identification and preference in Negro children, which is informally known as the doll study. The influential study was cited as evidence in the United States Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision, since it indisputably showed the harmful effects of segregated schools on racialized children who identified with the colored doll that they were shown by the researchers and yet perceived said doll as uglier than the white doll. Clark and Clark empirically demonstrated that this misperception can be explained in terms of the racialized children's internalization of racism, which is a radical psychosocial insight that analectical psychologists must pay attention to. Critical race theory, or CRT, which recently some conservative governments in the global north identified as a threat to whiteness, rose out of critical legal studies. Derek Bell is the originator of the movement, which currently includes many figures such as Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, as well as Tommy J. Curry, to name a few.
Just a reminder, Dr. Robert, there's a couple of minutes remaining. Thank you.
Okay. So since I won't be able to finish the paper, I'll give you a sense of what comes. The final section really focus on global Southern praxis, particularly resources from Africa, Latin America, and Asia that would be decolonial resources for what I'm talking about here as analectical psychology. So I'll end here and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robert Beshara, for a really, really fascinating and engaging read through of your essay. That's really, really, and sparks off so many different themes and areas of continuous discourse and for us to reflect upon. So thank you so much for that. I'll go to the floor now to ask if we have any questions. If anyone would like to come off mic, raise their hands. I can see there are a couple of questions in the chat box. So in lieu of any live questions in the room, I'll go straight to the chat box. Omar Espinoza, I can see that you've written a question in the chat box, so please feel free to come off mic if you would like. And give us some more insights into the question that you asked. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it was a very stimulating essay. Thank you. I'm going to read the question I wrote so I don't go every way. That scientific mimicry you refer to is the way we are unconsciously colonized as scholars. It seems like visualizing and making audible what regularly is not are perhaps the most potent and resistant practices we can choose. Letting those otherwise eclipsed experiences and narratives emerge is a revolutionary practice for psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, even today. Maybe describing what we are living among others at specific circumstances, as Delta, Brentano, and Freud intended, is the only way to restitute the human singularity that seems to be excluded and silenced today. Would you agree with that? I know that I'm referring to European thinkers that I think give us tools, but maybe what we need is actually a horizontal conversation where all kinds of things can emerge without a power relationship. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for your question. The way I hear it, it's something on the distinction between the singular and maybe the particular and the universal. So the as someone who's committed to psychoanalysis, and I'm not gonna hide that most of my work deals with sort of critique of psychoanalysis from a loving place, which can sound confusing to some people, but that's kind of like the way I engage in critique. And if there's something I don't care about, I don't think it's worth critiquing, right? So if I'm willing to spend time and energy, there has to be something that's rewarding, right? But in any case, the singular dimension is very important in psychoanalysis, right? Which is the dimension that is very specific to each single subject that cannot be universalized. And at the same time, psychology is interested in the universal dimension, but it does that through the level of the particular, which is, let's say, the cultural. So this mistake of kind of universalizing what is provincial, which is kind of my critique here, is we need to really move maybe toward what in Latin American philosophy is talked about as the pluriversal, is that there is not one universal, but maybe multiple universals. While at the same time acknowledging the singular, which could be an exception to these universals, right? I think the problematic level is always the level of the particular, because that's the level of culture and language and religion, and it's very important for us, but it sometimes can block this move from the singular to the pluriversal. And I think any sort of radical politics depends on that kind of jump from the singular to the pluriversal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It brings lots of questions, but hopefully we can continue.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. I can see we have another question in the chat box from Dr. Enver Kelly, who would like you to elaborate on the silence of critical psychology and a further elaboration on the colonial unconscious logic. Enver Kelly, did you want to come back with any further elaboration on those questions, or is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. The silence of critical psychology for me is, I think there are two, it's important to clarify that two general approaches to critical psychology. If I were to be reductive, there's one approach that critiques psychology in order to save it. So that's what maybe more popular. And there's another one, which is to critique psychology in order to ultimately dismantle it. My approach is the second one, which, not everyone will sign up for that, but that's kind of, I have to be honest that this is kind of my perspective, right? So when I speak about the silence of critical psychology, I'm talking about this approach wherein critical psychology is seen as a subdiscipline within psychology. So in many ways assimilated into mainstream Euromodern psychology, right? So that basically the critique is assimilated, and it becomes sort of, speaking of scientific mimicry earlier, becomes a scientific memory of Euro modern psychology, but in so-called critical fashion. So that's why I was critical of what is called critical modernism, which is a tradition of critiquing modernity from within, best exemplified by the Frankfurt School, and what is called postmodernity, which is kind of like also a critique of modernity from within that does not find any value in modernity. So the transmodern position is a critique of modernity from without, or from the exteriority of modernity. We can put it simply from a non-European perspective. And it's a critique that doesn't cancel Euromodernity, but so it's not saying that all of this is bad, because that would be obviously irrational, but it's to say that we don't have to take everything for granted as universal or factual. We can question, and we can think, and we can reason with, Euromodernity, and we might have some insights, new insights, new ideas, new epistemologies, new ontologies, new methodologies that are not covered by. And so that I'm trying to expand critical psychology. And I mean, obviously this conference has a good title in that sense, because it does have that global emphasis. So I want us to really think of critical psychology in a more global sense, and really emphasizing the role of the non-European in that. I think that's the first question. There was a second one. Can you remind me?
Absolutely. The second one was a further elaboration on the colonial unconscious logic.
Okay. So the colonial unconscious of psychology or psychoanalysis has to do with what is negated in that discourse or negated by that discourse. So a good example, and I don't get into this very much in this paper, but I do get into that in other papers, and this is something that Dussel writes about, is sort of, if we look at the genealogy of the subject, right? Psychology as a scientific discipline needs a universal subject to sort of universalize all these theories, right? And that subject is not an innocent subject. It's a particular subject, and it has a history. So you wouldn't get to that sort of modern subject without the history of colonization. So when I talk about the colonial unconscious, is that negation of that colonial history that provides the foundations and the possibility for the field of psychology and its conceptualization of the modern subject.
Brilliant, wonderful, thank you. And for Kelly, did you want to come back on that answer, or is that okay?
Well, you answered it very well, Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And we have what may be our final question in the chat box from Manuel Heller, who writes, in what ways should we try or not to institutionalize such an analytical psychology or critical psychology more broadly? This is a complex dialectical process in itself.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because I think the word institution can trigger a lot of traumatic reactions, right? A lot of times when we institutionalize things, they become more rigid, and groups and institutions tend to develop their own sort of symptoms and problems, and at the same time, I think it's a question about organization. Right? That's how I could take it positively. How do we organize? And that's the question of praxis, which is in the title of the paper. So maybe we should think about how we organize as analectical psychologists or critical psychologists in the global south, or non-European critical psychologists, maybe without institutionalizing, but focusing more on our praxis and how we organize. Obviously, we have to communicate, we have to be in dialogue, but I do worry about the question of institutionalization.
Thank you for that response. Manuel, did you want to come back and elaborate any further, or was that response sufficient for you?
It's sufficient for me, thank you. I agree with your reply. It's a very complex issue, especially from the decolonial paradigm and traditions. I was thinking of Mignolo's idea that we cannot ask for universities to do what they are not supposed to do, and will never do. So I was just thinking about that in terms of these new ideas for projects for a different psychology or for dismantling psychology. So thank you. That answer is perfectly stimulating.
Thank you. I mean, dialogue is the praxis, right? Always. So that has to be the foundation. And yeah, if it leads to institutionalization, it might go against the dialogical. And I think that's the trap.